Hello, and welcome again to the Surgical Clinics podcast. Surgical Clinics is a bi-monthly publication consisting of review articles devoted to a central topic important to general surgeons. Surgical Clinics has published for over 100 years, and the series and the podcast can be found at www.surgical.theclinics.com. I'm John Vassallo, the managing editor of the series here at Elsevier, and for our sixth podcast, we will be discussing three articles in the April 2023 issue on surgical decision-making, evidence, and artificial intelligence. Here to discuss articles on generational learning differences, cognitive bias, and use of machine learning and artificial intelligence in surgery will be our consulting editor of Surgical Clinics, Dr. Ron Martin, senior surgeon from the Department of General Surgery at Pullman Regional Hospital and Clinic Network in Pullman, Washington. Joining him will be two of the guest editors of the surgical decision-making issue, Dr. Jason Bingham, Associate Professor of Surgery and Chief at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences, and Chief of General Surgery at Madigan Army Medical Center in Tacoma, Washington, and also Dr. Carly Eckert, who is a clinical informaticist and epidemiologist that works with and for healthcare startups on clinical data science. Welcome to all three of you, and over to you, Dr. Martin.
Thanks very much, John. Appreciate it as always, and welcome to both Drs. Bingham and Dr. Eckert. Delighted to have you here. This issue is, as I wrote in the forward to it, this really started out as a conversation we were having sort of in each other's offices a couple of years back over at Madigan Area Medical Center, and the general topic of what do we know, how do we know it, how do we assess what we know, and how are we going to keep learning it. And I couldn't be more delighted that you guys were able to take this up and bring it out to fruition. I'd say that considering we started talking about this probably somewhere close to 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, we were pretty far ahead of the curve with all the recent interest in AI and models like that. So trying to get the surgical clinics to be on time with what's in the lay press is a chore, but you've managed. So I congratulate you. We're going to start out with an article. The first article here is one on generational learning by Drs. Waycamp and you, Dr. Bingham, Jason. So honestly, I could spend hours and hours on any one of these topics. We don't have that luxury, so we'll try to focus a little bit. But I'd like to start out, Jason, talking with just in terms of a couple of things that are striking as one reads through this article. And one of it, I would say, is let's go a little bit at the premise that the marked explosion and increase of the number of publications, does that or does not reflect an actual increase in knowledge? Because it's sort of discussed as a proxy. And I think I might have some thoughts on that, but what are your thoughts first?
Oh, yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think that's, so that really kind of gets at part of the heart of the issue of how do you distinguish relevant knowledge and information from the noise. I think what we've seen in the past couple decades is this exponential growth of data. Just because we have the data available to us, it's there. And combined with there's a lot of different motivations for scholarly activity and publication. So getting academic currency, you need it for tenure, you need it for promotion. There's the commoditization of research that has all led us to this point where we've had like a 60% increase in the number of journals in the last couple decades, and the number of PubMed articles is growing at an exponential rate that there's no way to master all that information. And I'm sure we all have that problem where it's getting harder and harder to distinguish what's actually relevant, what is knowledge and what is noise.
And I think that's always been an issue before the internet made us as connected as we are. I mean, the signal to noise ratio in medicine is not a new problem. It probably dates back to like the Uruk period or something. I mean, there's probably never been a beginning to that issue, but I think, one of the things that I was, very interested about in reading through the article is the context of behaviorism, connectivism, and constructivism, and sort of this concept of digital natives and digital immigrants. And as a guy who made my living before medicine with a software company, all of the original digital natives were digital immigrants, just kind of like all the founding fathers were Brits. They became colonials after the fact. But, we haven't quite aged out of the era, but we're probably going to in the next, I don't know, what do you figure, a couple of decades before everybody who's still practicing medicine will have always lived in the digital age. Give me a little bit of your thoughts on the people who didn't embrace technology maybe as quickly versus those who were in it from the get-go. And it is sort of implied in your article, I thought, that a lot of the people who needed to have caught up.
I do. So, I think originally when you're looking at this edition, this edition's about, surgical evidence and artificial intelligence. This chapter may seem, it's like, why are we talking about digital natives, digital immigrants? Why are we talking about how millennials learn? So, I think at first it might seem a little bit out of place, but I think the point I'm trying to get at here is it's not so much about what generation you are, and I think the data supports that this how millennials learn versus how boomers learn has probably been a little bit overstated, and it's more just people who is more active learners versus people who've kind of aged out and aren't learning anymore. I think people have adopted, but I think it's important to recognize that the way that we learn, so it's more the learners just in general, regardless of how old they are or what generation, or if they grew up, if they have an AOL account or a Gmail account or whatever, are the way that we're learning and we're interacting with information and data is changing and is evolving in response to technology. So I do think that kind of generational learning is a little bit overstated, but it's interesting to think about just in the way that we approach and knowledge and data. And like you say, there's different learning theories: behavioralism, connectivism, constructivism. I think that there's a really good article by George Seaman called Connectivism that is, I think, a good way of approaching a learning theory for the current digital age, where we talk about we live in a networked world where we're dealing with information that is connected, and in an environment where the amount of information is growing at an exponential rate, as at the same time that the half-life of that knowledge is decreasing. So I think back in the 80s, there've been studies that looked at how quickly medical knowledge turned over, and we're talking on the scale of decades before medical knowledge completely turns over. Well, now it's most recently it's about 5 years, with the expectation that in the coming decade we're going to be talking about the half-life of medical knowledge in months. So it's impossible to master all that information. So how do we learn how to navigate that network of information? So in a networked world, learning is a networked process and knowledge is a networked product. So I think that these concepts are important to think about in relation to how we interact with this knowledge and how do we measure competence and expertise and mastery of information in this networked knowledge economy.
I think it's also the folks who have that knowledge are kind of sometimes outside of maybe the traditional medical and clinical sense, right, or clinical roles. And so kind of instructing learners and physicians and residents to actually work with, maybe their IT teams or their data scientists, right? Or like who are kind of some of these other roles that are now going to be very important in how we think about extracting knowledge and putting some of this research into practice. I feel like that kind of the team has kind of grown in non-traditional ways that are kind of challenging how we've previously thought about learning and applying knowledge.
Yeah, and I think so. I want to bring up a concept and see how you react to it, but I don't think all knowledge has the same turnover rate. I mean, there are pantry items of knowledge, there's foundational knowledge, and then there are, the bananas that go bad in a day. And so, one of the things as now an old professor type is that the foundational knowledge is relatively stable in terms of just understanding how the human works. And a lot of people are losing sound foundational knowledge with which to build upon. And so, give me your thoughts about I mean, the latest and greatest and the newest and truest have been moving around as moving targets for a long time. I don't think the questions have changed very much since I was in medical school, and probably since my old professors were in medical school. The answers have changed a lot. But the basic stuff, there's still some stuff that we have to like anchor ourselves to reality. And in sort of your discussion on knowledge economy, I wonder, the subspecialization in some degrees has been about creating demand for their services, demand for their knowledges, demand for new and different. Generalization doesn't necessarily not do that, which is bad grammar, but it's, but there is some foundational stuff that we're seeing a lot of people not master in a timely manner. So, what are your thoughts on how do we get people to get the basic building blocks without believing that everything that needs to be learned has to have been written about in the last, 16 months?
Yeah, it's really hard. So that kind of gets back to our signal from the noise is that, how do we approach today's learners who are coming up in this environment where they're just inundated with so much data that it's impossible to master it all. So how do we, I think you have to approach it from, I think there is that fundamental, basis that we need to. It takes guys that have been around for a while to recognize that fundamental knowledge, but also how do we incorporate all this new data and teach people to navigate it? And I think that's where what Carly was saying about bringing in some people that are not in the traditional surgical teaching environment. I think tools like computer-based decision supports, AI is going to play an important role in seeing those patterns and making those connections where potentially, we just don't have the, biologic bandwidth to do. And we may be at it, we talk about there being fundamentals, but with, and now we're looking at things like genomics and proteomics that could, change some of that baseline foundation of how we understand how the body works. And with that, that's going to be another, networked product that's going to take some AI-powered tool for us to be able to interpret and apply.
No, I think you're right. I mean, it sort of leads me into another piece of it, and probably the last piece from this one, but sort of the concept of asynchronous learning. Because this is one that I wrestle with, because I think it's great for certain aspects of learning and terrible for others. So I want you to tell me why I'm wrong about it being terrible for others. But, when you and I work together, probably I think the most efficient use of learning in our day was the first meeting we had in the morning with everybody present. And if everybody were just trying to learn that off in their own world with their headphones on, in whatever means, there's a certain amount of learning that you get from listening to other people, even if you're not the one in the hot seat. And there's a certain amount of learning that you get from listening to people present their stories. And learning and assessing is a two-way street in academia. So when people are doing asynchronous learning, it doesn't necessarily give those of us who are in charge of assessing their capability or their progress or recognizing thought processes which could be tweaked. So how do we work the balance between not just people being in learning mode, but people also being in getting judged mode or assessed mode or learning from each other mode? What do you think about that?
I think you have to have both. I agree with you. I mean, I still say that to this day. The best part of my day is that 7:00 meeting where we all sit in a room and we bounce ideas off each other. But that doesn't mean that we can't, that these asynchronous tools that we have aren't force multipliers when it comes to that. It connects people across great distances and different time zones. The way that we interact, online and is becoming more and more relational and natural. That I don't think that, I think that I don't think these tools are going to replace clinicians or that personal aspect, but I do think that teachers and learners that use these tools are going to, or especially teachers that use these tools, are going to replace teachers that do not. So I think we need to embrace these, but I do agree with you that there is that personal aspect that is still the favorite part of my day.
Do you think that our youngest colleagues share yours and mine's opinion that being in that group and being sort of open to being called upon at any moment? And do you think they see that as valuable as we do?
The good ones do.
Yeah, agreed. And you got nothing but good ones. I mean, I still will say that probably the best training environment I've ever been in my life was at Madigan Area Medical Center. And that might anger some people that were when I was program director at other facilities, but Madigan's certainly a bunch of people who are highly motivated to do well and to excel. And it deserves all the credit in the world for that.
I agree with you. I'm very lucky, but I think that's it's a culture issue, and that takes there's no simple answer to that question. It takes leadership and cultivating that culture.
So let's move along a little bit. I mean, it's probably going the same general direction, but we're talking about a little bit, but we're going to move into cognitive bias. And honestly, either one of you feel free to jump in here, but this is the article by Richburg, Dossett, Hughes. And I will say that one of my biases in reading through the chapter were a lot of the examples that were given where somebody took a few factoids and leapt to an answer. That was more somebody not being very good at developing a broad differential diagnosis. And I think personally, as a former writer of boards questions, where there's one answer that people get when they, take it online now, and versus the oral boards, I always felt more comfortable that we were testing the real knowledge of people in the oral boards environment, because people could give you an answer and then expound upon how they got there or what their thinking was. You could kind of follow it back and forth. Whereas somebody clicking A, B, C, or D, I never really felt I understood what they necessarily meant by that. So I think that having a broad differential diagnosis, because there's a couple of things. I want to give you a couple up front, and then I'll let you lead into it. There was a discussion about diagnostic error bias among internist and emergency room personnel, and then an assumption that those studies apply to surgeons equally. I don't want to sound surgeon-centric, but I don't think that's true. And I think part of it is because surgeons train in a very different model than our internal medicine colleagues and ER people. We have a much different sense of M&M, and we tend to be a lot more rigorous in the modeling. Plus, we make our mistakes relatively early and relatively readily apparent. You do the wrong operation, you usually figure that out in short order. Whereas our other colleagues don't have that luxury of you do something and the impact is so immediately visible to everyone, including themselves. So how much of the cognitive bias, for example, is just not really taking a long enough time to develop a breadth of options rather than just get the one finding off a CAT scan and run from there?
I would tend to agree with you, although I would say that, well, it may start just to be beneficial just to start with like a couple definitions. So, when we talk about, cognitive bias, we're really just talking about those shortcuts, those subconscious shortcuts that we make, that we apply to new scenarios based on our experience. I mean, that's the practice of medicine, right? That's looking for patterns. I mean, so cognitive biases can be useful, especially, for surgeons who oftentimes you have to make decisions quickly, often life-saving interventions that need to be made quickly. So we rely on those shortcuts, but, I might disagree with you a little bit that I think that, in some ways we are, I don't disagree with you that I'm very surgeon-centric, and I do think that I agree with you that we're better than everybody else at most things. But I would say that the environment that we operate in may reinforce some of those cognitive biases, those shortcuts that we fall back on. I think we can be, even myself can be a little bit quick to jump to a conclusion based off the experiences And I think a lot of our training maybe reinforces that as well. Like you said, the way that we test knowledge now, which I agree with you. I think we're terrible, and we're only getting worse at testing knowledge the more complex things get. And leading back to our prior discussion about generational learning and the exponential data and the networked environment or network nature of knowledge, I think we're getting worse at testing that. But that reading the first line of the question and being able to say the answer is C, that, you know, and I get 99th percentile on my ABSCIIT every year based off of that. I think those patterns can reinforce bad habits of falling back on our cognitive biases, which, again, those shortcuts can be useful, but it's just, I think it's important just to understand that that's what you're doing, and being able to take a step back, switch from that system one thinking of that fast thinking to that system two thinking of that slow, broader differential, and ask yourself, let's take a second, step back, and think about this. I think we do a great job of that. Again, I'm going to put in our plug for getting in the same room every morning with your colleagues and saying, what does everybody else think about this?
I think in fairness, I think if we all look back, it becomes very experiential, because I think the earlier you are in your career with the less broad sense of this and that, and having made the wrong call fewer times, then you go in when somebody calls you from the ER and says somebody has whatever, appendicitis, you go down thinking you're going to see a patient with appendicitis. After you go down enough times and realize that wasn't right, you start thinking, I don't care what they said, I'm coming down. For all I know is that I need to go to the ER. And there's somebody down there they want me to see. And it's not that you don't want to believe the other people, but, you know, as we've discussed in these morning meetings with people, the people who are more senior, they listen to the person like walking off the ledge in their story, and you all know where they're going with it. Everybody like sees the trap coming. And that obviously, you know, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. And I guess the hopes are with machine learning and artificial intelligence and some of this other stuff, that these patterns are going to be more easily presented to us if we don't already have this pattern recognition down ourselves. Or maybe we'll develop better pattern recognition ourselves using these tools to supplement other judgment and correct our own persistent biases that don't hold up.
Well, I think it's also like what you're saying, that you recognize that that's a cognitive bias too. The fact that you're listening to the intern up there, and you know they're going in the wrong direction, and you pick up on that quickly, or you're that ER R2 who's calling you with telling you that story of appendicitis, and that feeling that this isn't adding up. That's your fast thinking based on your experience, a cognitive bias. So they can be useful, but just recognize what they are and be able to navigate those emotions yourself. And I think you're spot on. I think that's the a very exciting potential role for artificial intelligence and clinical decision, computer-based clinical decision-making tools that can do our slow thinking fast for us.
I will say that I think there's a risk there for, another kind of bias, right? Which is when people will start acting on what the algorithm says and not thinking through, what else. Because while we say that algorithms can manage millions of data points, right? The algorithm is not yet like in the room with the patient, right? Looking at them, talking to them. There's certainly data elements and context and, situational awareness that the algorithm is not incorporating. Potentially, it's very important, I think, that we consider these as tools that are going to augment practice, and that folks aren't ignoring any provider intuition based on outputs from machine learning.
When I go back to my old days in computer software and some hardware work that I did, one of the axiomatic principles is that it's much easier to design computer output devices. It's easy to send something to a printer, to a screen, to whatever, than it is to define computer input devices. I mean, you have keyboards, but you can't really teach them to see as effectively. And of course, there's all kinds of examples of people trying to pass Turing tests and so forth. But, there's always that problem. And some of it comes into some of the other discussion about, this extreme sensitivity to initial conditions and dependence upon initial conditions, getting accurate input, because otherwise your algorithms go mental. But But there was another bias in the cognitive bias chapter that struck me a little bit that I wanted to get your thoughts on, partly because, you're in the military, as I was for a while, and the forces at play there are slightly different in terms of things, but the specialty bias part, because to me, having worked in a number of different capacities, both in the private and public sectors, there are different forces at play to get people to want to do what they want to do. So some of it's economic, which I don't think applies to the military at all, thankfully, which is one of the things I liked about it. That was certainly in my private practice world and executive world. You had to take that into account. Some of it is people super interested in developing something new and exciting, or they just want to operate a lot, or they want to use the robot a lot because they want to get better at using robot, or whatever it is, or that they're afraid that if they don't operate when somebody sends them a patient, somebody's going to stop sending them patients or whatever. So, what do you think about these external forces at play and how much that drives specialty bias versus just the knowledge aspect of it alone?
No, I think a lot. I mean, I think it's a perfect example of the robot, and I think it kind of inserts itself in those areas where there's not potentially a clear answer. So, for instance, I'm a robotic surgeon, and if I'm seeing a patient with an inguinal hernia, I'm going to offer them a robotic repair. There's not a lot of data that says my robotic repair is better than your your robotic repair, your laparoscopic repair, my colleague's open repair. But I certainly have my biases that is going to be inserted into that conversation. So, I don't know. There's a whole lot I could do about that. There's not going to be a randomized controlled trial that's going to compare my robotic repair to my partner's, open inguinal hernia repair. But I think that there are ways that I can, once I understand that I have that bias, that I know that I can build that into my counseling to the patient to help them make an informed decision based on their preferences and their values. So I think you have to put in those checklists or those roadblocks into your own practice to mitigate those biases that we all have as best as possible.
So, recent article came out a little bit ago looking at robotic versus laparoscopic cholecystectomy. And while I will grant you up front that its output measured was quality adjusted life years, and that's a tough one for an operation that almost always goes fine, no matter how it's done. But nonetheless, what interested me wasn't so much the paper. At the end of it, it said it was like something like $1.7 million cost for quality adjusted life year of doing it robotically versus laparoscopically. But none of the discussants had anything to say about the paper. All of their comments were the same exact thing. I feel better at the end of the day when I've done 3 lap choles with a robot than I do if I do 3 lap choles or 3 laparoscopic choles in the standard laparoscopic fashion. None of them had anything to say about whether the patient was better off or not. So I'm not sure which metrics I want to, part of me, I'm old. I did these open. So going to laparoscopes was like a huge step forward. And I've really not found a laparoscopic cholecystectomy that made me feel like I couldn't go home at night and move my arms. I haven't run into that yet. I've found some that make me want to pull my hair out for other reasons, but I don't think it would any better with a robot. It's not seeing what you want to see and, bad anatomy, bad pathology. But I think this is should we take into account, with all the concern about physician burnout and everything else, should we take into account that the patients may have to pay a premium so that the people who are operating on them feel better about themselves at the end of the day?
Well, I think that's going to be we're never going to be able to do that study, I don't think, because I'm one of those surgeons. I feel better at the end of the day after doing my robotic cholecystectomy, and I can tell you that in my hands, I'm giving you a better operation. I just am. In somebody else's hands, maybe not, but in my hands, I'm giving you a better operation. There are cases that I can get done. Those nasty gallbladders, those 90-year-old guys, I have a better chance of getting that done minimally invasive, getting it done safely, and getting you home on the robot than I can any other way. It's intangible. I'm not going to be able to do. I can't design a randomized controlled trial to tell you that that's the case. But I'm going to understand. But I can understand that that's a bias on my part, right? And I need to recognize that.
No, that's great. So why don't we maybe Carla, can we push off to the machine learning and artificial intelligence chapter? And again, I think we could spend hours and hours, and I appreciate the time you are spending. I'm not asking you to, but any one of these topics we could go down innumerable pathways. But this is the paper from Douglas, Calcutt, Seeley, and Merchant. And what I found was that looking through it, there were sort of three broad areas that I wanted us to sort of address and get your thoughts on. One was, what's the role of machine learning and artificial intelligence and analytics, like image analysis, trend analysis, that sort of thing? Another bit might be, where does it fit in helping us in terms of predictive abilities? Trying to guess. And then the last bit might be something he was talking about towards the end of the article, which is sort of like procedural operative support. So either computer-assisted robotic operations, laparoscopic, or some of the examples given were ortho, neuro, hardware placement. But if we can, let's start out with the analytic bits, if you don't mind, and give us a general overview and work us into that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's like 3 or 4 kind of chapters in this collection that all kind of hit different foundational aspects of artificial intelligence and ML. This chapter really goes into kind of some concrete and actual use cases for it in surgery. I think really the effort here is to kind of demystify it a little bit for practicing surgeons, right? For folks who don't have tech backgrounds and things like that. I think there's a lot of vernacular here that we really want to kind of bring folks up to speed with. Obviously, kind of, how some of these models and technologies work, and also really importantly, how we talk about evaluating them. Big data is obviously a word we all know and throw around, right? But I think how that applies to healthcare is still a bit of an unknown for a lot of practicing physicians out there. And so, I think part of this chapter's goal and the other chapters like it is really to kind of bring people into this world a little bit and, kind of make some of these definitions a little bit more tangible for them. So, kind of your remark about analytics and surgery, the authors kind of point out a couple of the advances in use of artificial intelligence in imaging related to surgical cases and topics. So they mentioned, kind of radiography and radiology, specifically around mammography. Interestingly, this has been around for, decades. I think it was 1998 that the first use of AI and ML was approved by the FDA for mammography. And, the use cases since then have just really grown exponentially. I think something like 80% of the most recently approved kind of batch of FDA algorithms was all related to radiography or imaging of some sort. So this is really a, thriving and kind of viable area for computer vision and for, AI and ML in general.
One point there. So one of the things that sort of surprised me over the long haul when it came to machine image analysis was it seemed like a lot of the mammographic stuff that is done is teaching machines how a radiologist interpreted X picture, giving them a huge data bank, and then going back and seeing if the machine can look at the pictures, does it come up with a viewpoint that the radiologist would have? Versus, I kind of always thought that where the machines were going to beat the radiologists was something novel, like fractal geometry dimensions for neoplastic things because they have nonlinear fractal coefficients, or something in the mathematical world that was going to be like, you can't see that no matter how hard you look. You need a machine to tell you your branching pattern has a geometric number of 2.6. That doesn't exist in nature, normal nature. But it doesn't look like it's going that way. It looks like it's going more towards being able to reproduce what good radiologists can do.
Well, so, I think there's kind of 2 ways to think about that. One, I think we can get into this habit of using, when we're using existing medical data to train our algorithms, right? We're using past patterns of care. And there's all sorts of issues and problems and challenges with, how the practice of medicine has evolved and kind of train, basically robots to do the same thing, right? We're not going to make a lot of gains. I think there is some gain there if we talk about consistency and reader fatigue and things like that, right? We can still we don't have to worry about that with algorithms and robots. I think there is still some work being done in how do we actually find these findings that humans can't, right? And there has been some work, actually looking at normal images and abnormal images and allowing the machine to kind of find it without actually pointing it to the aberration or the lesion, I believe. So I think there is some work there, but outside of computer vision, that's also how do we get these robots to actually train on maybe the ideal practice or the ideal version.
So when you look at it, like one of the scenarios they had in there was looking at some small variations in people picking up pneumothoraces in an ICU setting. And I was thinking to myself, how many, even if you are picking up some like really tiny things, how many of these are clinically relevant? So it's one thing to pick up a 2% pneumothorax on a CAT scan that got done. And it's a whole other thing to pick up something where somebody needs intervention or management of some sort.
I think the clinical utility of a lot of these use cases are still being discussed. I think they also mentioned this in the section on mammography, right? The increased sensitivity comes with, a decrease in specificity. There's trade-offs in kind of how these models work and what they find, and then kind of, what do you do with it, right? In the case of breast lesions, right? Do you end up biopsying all these things that don't need to be? Your case about pneumothoraces, right? Do we end up, causing iatrogenic injuries in folks where things would have resolved? So I think, there's been so much kind of research, so many publications in this space, and yet the kind of translation to clinical practice, has been much rarer for a lot of these models. And I think that's what you're pointing to, right? Is the clinical utility hasn't always been demonstrated. Just because models can do something, right, doesn't mean they should.
Well, one thing I found interesting is, if I recall correctly, and I read this a bit ago, but at least in the one that was looking at the breast imaging data, that I think one of the models had trained on data where there'd been two separate radiologists who had read, and then they used the model to look at stuff that only one radiologist had read. So to me, it's fascinating. If you can show that two radiologists reading something produces a bit, then the question is can one radiologist plus machine assistance be as good as two radiologists?
Exactly. Yeah. How can we augment kind of the work we're doing rather than replace it? I think that's really where this can shine.
So what are your thoughts on sort of predictive ability, predicting mal-outcomes, predicting mortality, predicting longevity?
Yeah. There's so many, potential use cases for this. We've talked about big data. I think, the really solving some of these challenges, or at least kind of, how we think about the models, is the quality of the data. And that continues to be a really challenging problem. We know interoperability of healthcare data is really, really challenging. And I think the clinical utility of a lot of these use cases kind of needs to continue to be shown. Predicting readmissions, predicting clinical deterioration, predicting length of stay, things like that. I think a lot of these models kind of have the potential to improve efficiency and obviously clinical care and some of our decision-making capabilities. But we're still, I think, having some of the challenges with data. The other interesting component about some of these machine learning algorithms is that it's really important that they're externally validated, right, before they're actually put into practice. And that's another part that has been really challenging for some of these clinical models, if you want to call them that, right? Because a clinical deterioration model might have a certain performance in one health system, right? That performance might be very different in another. And so kind of how do we think about generalizability of these models? And, if we're actually going to be deploying these in a clinical setting, how are we kind of monitoring shifts in data and kind of how that is now going to be impacting how the model performs?
As a former executive, I would love to see this stuff applied to some of this readmission data. Because to me, not all readmissions are the same. If a bunch of people go home on day of an operation or the next morning, and 20% of them come back, but they come back for something where you can help them get straightened out in an hour or two, or maybe an afternoon, you can always avoid the penalty for readmission, which is usually substantial. Just hold on to people for 3 or 4 days, and the longer you keep them, but still the net result of how much care and resources they needed. I mean, some people they need a little tune-up, and we don't tend to look at it because, at least in the private sector, a readmission within 30 days is just, whether the person came back in arresting, whether they came back in because they were concerned about a bandage that fell off and they couldn't get a ride home. You get hit with the same mallet, no matter, in terms of penalties, no matter which of the two it were. So, it's like looking through this stuff to predict if this person's readmitted, it's going to be for something serious that we definitely don't want them to go home with. That the failure is going to be more catastrophic or less catastrophic. I'd love to see us get better at that. And maybe even distance related for people. Like, certainly there are people that are coming to Madigan or Seattle that are flying from long ways away. And when my job was such that people were driving 8 hours or flying 4 or 5 hours to get there, we were more hesitant to send them home. Just because of the logistics, not because of any brilliance. Maybe if we had better tools for predicting, we'd have been more comfortable. But let's talk a little bit about procedural support. Because some of the examples that were given were like putting difficult screws into challenging places, spines and other places where you don't want to be off and cause a lot of bleeding mayhem and neurologic mayhem. But what do you think about that versus, let's go back to Jason's example of taking a robot to take out somebody's gallbladder. That may not be as easily supportable, I think, with just regular preoperative imaging data. But where do you think the opportunities are initially, and where do you think we might get to with computer-assisted procedural support?
I think the incorporation of AR and VR into kind of pre-surgical planning is a really interesting space.
I always thought that in my liver days, liver mets were going to be the smart target. Because you got an organ that doesn't have a lot of good surface landmarks on a good day. It's distorted by any number of malignant, non-malignant purposes. And the idea that you could have a VR overlay of all your MR information or CT information going after metastases seemed to be like a really clever use of computer-generated support. Whereas I think maybe going after a regular gallbladder or, dealing with something else, maybe it's a bit overkill for that.
I think also and Jason jump in, but I think for surgical training, there's also a lot of potential use cases there in terms of kind of, how do we make sure we're exposing our trainees to, potentially different types of cases, and they might see, even in their program, perhaps, through some of these kind of augmented reality technologies.
Yeah, I think you can even being able to the simulators now aren't really good at generating high fidelity, and especially things like altered anatomy or simulations based off of real-time clinical imaging. I think there's a huge potential for that. I think as far as like augmented reality, I mean, we're already seeing some of that stuff. Like, I mean, I hate to keep returning to the robot, but the robot measures the thickness of tissues and tells me when the stapler is, is not the right, staple height. We're already kind of getting that feedback based on some of these machine learning algorithms. Certainly with the ICG and visualizing the biliary system, we're seeing a lot of that. There's augmented. I know there's work. I'm not sure I'm supposed to disclose this, but we're doing some work looking at removing with the company, looking at removing smoke from the field. So it's being able to see through smoke using augmented reality based off of computer vision and machine learning algorithms. So you imagine you'd be able to take your CT scan and you'd be able to see through the liver and see where the lesion is when you're doing your resection. So I think those are all very promising and exciting things that seem a little bit like science fiction, but I think this technology it's hard for us to conceptualize exponential growth. So we may start seeing these things sooner than we think.
Well, I think you're right. I think we're way closer than people think. And just looking now, going into almost my 40th year of doing this in some way or another, the writing's on the wall. And I can say definitely after being in a place where you and I were working together, where you've got a great simulation lab and double trainer robotics, you double console robotics things, and you go to places that don't have that, your ability to incorporate this knowledge is insanely better in an environment like you have than if you're not in a place that has all that stuff. That people don't want to spend the money to have these, I mean, for obvious reasons. But, just a double console robot in and of itself, when somebody's from one specialty is having trouble and need help from another specialty, and you can't just sit down together, it is a world of difference compared to what we had available just a few hours drive away. Now that we're separated by a little distance, but that stuff that's going to get factored into how people can implement this, teach it, learn it, verify it, is, working with that. And then I think, because the rest of the stuff, the image superposition stuff, that's just software. And not to minimize it, but we already know that our friends who write software can turn out an endless amount of that stuff. So they seem to be.
It's going to be expensive, though. It's going to be expensive. I feel like I'm kind of getting off on a tangent, but we're going to use the best. Back to your point, it's hard to. We're not going to. It's hard to. It's going to be really hard to measure the added value of it for a while, I think. And I think we're seeing that case with the robot right now. It's really hard to measure the added value. But for me as a clinician, I'm going to use the best tool I have available to me.
Yeah. But I think your comments about the ability to differentially and safely assess what you're looking at with the robot, to me, are a much more resounding argument-wise than, not that I want you to have a sore back, don't misunderstand me, I want you to feel great all the time. But, but the things where somebody says, I can light up the biliary tree, and I can use different imaging modalities that don't exist, that's hard to dispute, no matter what a person's pinching their pennies. And everything we've started has been expensive initially. But, Moore's Law, and since this was written, and, Moore has passed away just recently, and, there may not be an infinite ability for Moore's Law to hold up on chip processing for physics reasons, and, nanometer etchings and stuff like that. But he didn't think it was going to last anywhere near as long as it did, and it lasted his lifetime. So good for him. There's going to be these things that are going to make the rest of this stuff cheaper, easier to use. And we'll play that game the way I think we always have in modern medicine. Some of it will be political. You get far enough up in the food chain in any of these organizations, whether it's the military or the private sector, you realize your ability to get money largely depends on somebody's political mood at a given moment. So you got to work with, and that's how you interact with society. So that's not altogether bad.
And the market will ultimately decide.
It will. It always has. Thank you, Adam Smith, for joining the conversation. So in the last few minutes we have, you guys tell me what you think about where we are with AI, machine learning on the big C, where we are with medicine, where you think the intercepts are, where you think we're going to go, and let's round out with your thoughts on some of this big stuff, large language models, that kind of thing. Carly, what do you think?
Yeah, it was almost funny that ChatGPT came out, right as we were kind of getting to some of the editorial process of putting together this collection. It's really too bad that we couldn't have included more about this kind of in the collection, but certainly there'll be more to come. And it's so interesting, just the amount of really chatter already about some of these large language models and their applications in healthcare. Just, caveat, I'm certainly not an expert in this space. There's been some really great resources out there for folks who want to learn more, and a lot of hypothesizing about, its use in healthcare. I think, when it's going to be, I think, really interesting kind of how we navigate some of these potential use cases. Obviously things like they're really intelligent chatbots for knowledge retrieval and things like that. And then as they get kind of potentially more specialized and actually trained on healthcare data, it'll be really interesting what we kind of allow them to be used for, and how we start evaluating that. There's already been, I saw a paper out today from Vanderbilt that was looking at kind of asking the large language model to kind of augment and tweak, I guess, clinical decision support rules so they would kind of be more effective for physicians. So kind of less, alarm fatigue and clicking and things like that. So there's already really kind of some interesting use cases for how can we use this for efficiency gains for our clinical providers.
How long do you think it's before we see somebody in a defendant's chair that tries to make the argument that AI gave him or her the diagnosis and they acted on it and turned out not to be right, and who's on the hook?
I mean, it's interesting, right? I've seen one of the papers that's come out recently is, the performance of GPT-4, which is not the one that's available. It's not the one that's publicly available. It's the more advanced model and kind of its performance on the USMLE, step 1, step 2, step 3, right? And it performs very well, like 89 percentile, right? But as we talked about already, right, those are kind of using really heuristics and biases for kind of shortcuts, right, to get to the answer. And really, that's not how we take care of patients. So it's interesting when you see all this hype around it, and then think through, okay, but again, that's not where we really see clinical utility. So I hope, right, that we make very small incremental moves to kind of how we start incorporating this, but things don't always work that way.
I'm not sure how we handle the ethics part, to be honest with you. I mean, I know that the journalists are losing their minds collectively. I don't want to insult them, but over the fact that ChatGPT can write things and they make their living out of writing things. And there's a handful of other people that are in the wordsmithing parts of the world that are a little concerned of it. They're coming out with fakes of, Drake and other performers, and everybody's getting a little tense and nervous. But for us, I mean, there's been a call by some, notably being famous guys like Musk and so forth, talking about a pause in AI. And I mean, maybe not, but at some point, if we're going to let this drift into decision augmentation and or anything else in terms of implementation of medicine, we're going to have to come up with the ethical boundaries and make sure that everybody's got, and I don't, honestly, I haven't seen a good example of anybody doing this well historically for any other technology. So I'm not super psyched to think that this is just going to magically work itself out.
Oh yeah, I don't think it will. I think we need more physicians at the table. I think we need more physicians who understand, how these models work, when they don't work, when they shouldn't be used. I think we need more discussions about, what are the guidelines and the green field and things like that. Because, I mean, to your point, we haven't regulated any technology well as of late. And this hasn't started off that way either.
Thoughts on that, Jason?
I think it's just really like, as Carly said, I mean, the fact that this thing has exploded onto the field in the way that it has in the short time since we put, this collection of articles together and published, I think that's a sign of things to come. I share everybody's pessimism. I don't know that I don't know that there's a good answer. And it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be really interesting. But the only thing we can do is have more people that with these concerns sitting at the table, like Carly said.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm very much hoping that whether by accident of history or whatever, that the work that you guys did and came up with this is going to be out in multiple platforms, giving people an opportunity to really much better education. This is a fascinating collection of articles. You guys did a great job editing it. Please give my best to Matt when you get a chance to talk with him. But I think this really has been super timely on a topic, and surgical clinics, to be fair to Elsevier, when I took over as the consulting editor to this now a couple decades ago, we agreed to put out an issue that wasn't another chapter on melanoma, another chapter on breast cancer. Well, that's all important stuff, and we do put it out, but the foresight of the company to let us take issues that were sort of on the tangent. I think every tangential issue we picked has wound up being really important for everybody's discussion in the practice over the years. I think history has sort of held up with us on that. This one, I think, is going to be at the top of the list when we look back at it, 10 years from now, is that this has really got people hopefully it'll get them in a headspace where they'll start thinking about these things, because this wave is coming down the river quickly. And people are about to get wet, and let's hope they don't drown. But I can't thank you guys enough for all the time you put on with us, and for taking time out of your day-to-day to talk with us. Everything else, the readership owes you both a great debt. So thank you.
Well, thank you to your vision in putting this together, and to the clinics for their vision as well, and to all of our authors. It was a pleasure, and we had a fantastic time.
Thank you for joining us for this Surgical Clinics podcast devoted to surgical decision-making, evidence, and artificial intelligence. The 3 articles discussed, as well as 8 others, are in the April 2023 issue, Volume 103, Number 2. The series is available for individual print or online subscriptions. Visit www.surgical.theclinics.com to subscribe. The series is also on the Elsevier digital platforms Clinical Key and Science Direct. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @Surgical Clinics, and you can subscribe to the podcast through Apple, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and Amazon Music. Thanks for listening.